So again, we're looking at the whole letter of Titus, and I suggested that the first task you should undertake is to look at where God is presented and how God is spoken of throughout the whole letter. And we're still going to be talking about the whole letter today. And what we noticed in one of our first tasks was that there's different virtues of God that are revealed at different parts of the letter. For example, in chapter 1, it specifically says that God who never lies has been manifested. That is, the God who doesn't lie has manifested his word. As you go into chapter 2, it speaks of the grace of God and how that has appeared. And then in chapter 3, we get the reference to God's goodness and his loving kindness and how that also has appeared. So these different virtues, divine attributes that appear in different parts of the letter, and that as you look at the different parts, you see that where chapter 1 is talking about the appointment of elders, chapter 2 is giving us instructions for households, and chapter 3 is talking about life in the broader secular, non-believing community. So the question I raised last time was, how does the fact that God never lies relate to this discussion in chapter 1 about the appointment of elders? How does the grace of God, obviously the grace of God is different from God's fidelity, his loyalty to us through his promises. How does the grace of God relate to instructions for households? And then finally, how does the loving kindness and the goodness of God relate specifically to life in the broader community? And you'll see that these different virtues also, it turns out, correspond to the different divine persons of the Trinity. In chapter 1, there's specific discussion about God the Father and how he doesn't lie. In chapter 2, there's a specific reference to the role of the Son of God and how he gave himself for us. And then in chapter 3, it talks for the first time in the letter about the Spirit of God. So all three of the divine persons have a role in this letter, and the different attributes and virtues of God that are spoken of are in very specific contexts dealing with different types of problems and issues. So the question then is, how does God not lying relate to the appointment of elders, say, in chapter 1? What do the two have anything to do with one another? And so in order to make some progress on that question, we can see that where in chapter 1, verse 3, again, now we're looking at the text here, and it says, which I think I've said this is the ESV version, but just so you know, the English Standard Version, the God who never lies is mentioned here in verse 2. But now let's read just a little farther into the context where Paul says that he left Titus in Crete in order for him to appoint elders. So that's the rest of the chapter. But notice in the midst of that discussion about appointing elders and all the attributes elders have to have, notice that Paul quotes a Cretan poet. And when he quotes the Cretan poet, look at what the poet said. He said, Cretans, this is verse 12, are always liars. Now, you can't miss the connection here now. The Cretans have a problem. It's just part of one of their ethnic deficiencies, national deficiencies. They're always liars. Well, it turned out that up here, it spoke of God as somebody who never lies, right? So we're in the same chapter. We're talking about a similar context, and sure enough, we have two statements that are clearly very closely related to one another. The Cretans always lie. They have this a problem of habitual deceit, and God is somebody who's the opposite of that. So that then puts us on our next task. In what sense is God not lying, God being faithful, God being loyal to his promises? In what sense is that an antidote to the problem of habitual deceit. How does God's not lying serve as a kind of solvent to the dye of deceit? And so that's your next task. You easily could spend a day or two just thinking about how those two ideas might relate to one another, and how God's own virtue is a solution, is a salvation, a deliverance to this problem, which I think is pretty obviously a problem which all of us can relate to. So that's your task for next week. Best wishes, and I'll see you in the next video.